And we're back here on Capitol tonight. After being under fire for months, both here in New York and around the country, labor unions are taking a stand. While negotiations with the public employee unions here never reached the tension they did in Wisconsin, Governor Cuomo did openly and repeatedly say that state worker unions would need to make some concessions due to the state's financial problems. But the rejection of the PEF contract was the first sign that union members are not just going to accept the governor's terms. And now, many public and private worker unions are lending their support to the Occupy Wall Street protests and its spin-offs around the country. Those protests are also getting some more attention. But will attention turn into influence? Joining me now to discuss the situation is our Reporter Roundtable. Tonight, I'm joined by Eric Chris from the New York Post and Glenn Blaine from the Daily News, both to my left, and to my right, John Campbell from the Gannett News Service. Guys, thanks for being here.
Thank you.
Nice to be here.
Okay, so let's talk first about the Public Employee Federation contract. We were expecting to hear news whether there would be some sort of contract agreement or not by today. And, Friday still isn't over, but it seems like we're not going to get any sort of indication about this contract.
And the reason today was important is the layoffs of 3,500 PEF members are supposed to begin on October 19th. And if the union and the Cuomo administration are going to strike a new deal, they need time to put the new deal in writing, to send ballots to their members, to have a revote before the layoffs take place. Because think about it, if the layoffs take place on October 19th,
right,
then all those laid-off employees can't vote on the new contract. The employees who are still there, who aren't afraid of losing their jobs, would be the only ones to vote on it. So what would be their incentive?
Well, that's going under the presumption that, and this is something that E.J. McMahon of the Empire Center and Cuomo himself has said, is that there were a number of people who voted no on the contract because they knew they would be receiving pay increases anyway under the Triborough Amendment.
Well, that's true. But again, I think you have a better shot at ratifying a new renegotiated contract if the people who stand to lose their jobs without one are able to vote.
Well, Glenn, I mean, is it possible that you can renegotiate a contract, say, by, I don't know, shortening the length of that contract and still keeping it revenue neutral?
Well, the governor kind of left the door open to that a little bit yesterday, but he also repeatedly said, I think he said it 3 or 4 times, it's up to PEF. I think, he's making it clear that, he's not really willing to budge a whole lot on this contract, and it's really up to PEF and PEF's leaders to sell it to their members. And he made a point of noting that the CSEA adopted a similar contract and ratified a similar contract with their members, and he praised CSEA's leaders for agreeing to this contract. Didn't say the same thing about PEF's leadership.
We haven't seen the tweaks yet, the so-called revenue neutral tweaks, but I mean, the difference now and what the governor is banking on is exactly what she said. Now there are layoff notices out. They're hoping that changes people's minds. And we're going to see some tweaks. We might see it shortened. But it seems that they're heading toward a vote on a tweaked deal, and it'll they're going to have to scramble to get it out before the layoff notices take effect.
Yeah, I think the one thing that we've seen in the last couple of days, especially this week, is that nobody obviously wants layoffs. I mean, these would be the largest round of layoffs, mass layoffs, since the governor's father was governor nearly 20 years ago. I mean, is it politically smart, I guess, for these layoffs to move forward? Because we are talking about people's lives, people's livelihoods. This economy is still kind of stuck in a state of neutral right now. Is it politically viable for the governor to move forward with these layoffs?
I would say that a better way to put it is that it would be politically disadvantageous for him not to move forward if there's no new deal reached that's acceptable to both sides. Governor Cuomo has built his reputation on staking out a position and following through and sticking with it. If he caves on this, I think that could damage his standing in the eyes of many New Yorkers. Obviously, state employees aren't going to be thrilled with him if the layoffs go forward, but in a state with 19 million people, there are a lot more voters who are not state employees than who are.
Plus, he's still negotiating other contracts with other state unions.
Good to keep in mind.
So if he gives on this, then it sets a precedent that he might have to follow with the other unions. It might also infuriate members of the CSEA who have already ratified pretty much the same contract.
Right, John, and actually on your blog today, you posted something that was pretty interesting. There was some information from UUP, which is a union that represents SUNY professors, SUNY workers. There's a lot of outstanding labor issues out there, obviously, and that's something that underscored, at the very least.
Well, and it did, and it was essentially a first contract proposal, and UUP was looking for raises, but I mean, when you have the top two unions,
good luck with that. Exactly,
and that was the whole strategy from the beginning. You get the two major ones to agree to something, and then hopefully the rest of the dominoes will fall. But moving forward, I mean, it's just tough for those smaller unions to agree really to anything other than what was laid out in this PEF deal and the CSEA deal.
Right, and plus the governor, we have to keep in mind, there's the overall issue, and we've mentioned this before, but the overall issue of this $450 million in workforce savings that the governor still needs to achieve in order to keep the budget in balance. I mean, are we on track to achieve that targeted savings?
I don't think we've heard that we're not on track, but that underscores the difficulty of renegotiating this PEF deal. The PEF deal was crafted...
Very little wiggle room.
Yeah,
right.
The PEF deal was crafted to achieve savings in the early part of the contract. That's when employees would have to take unpaid furlough days. They would immediately have to start paying more for their health insurance. And the sweeteners, if you will, are later on in the contract, where they'd get a retention bonus for staying on and other benefits. But you've got to save the money early rather than later. And so when the governor talks about revenue neutrality, what he means is that whatever the original contract that was rejected by the members would save this year and probably next year, you have to keep that dollar figure from going up.
And the state's budget position isn't getting any better. I mean, the governor was saying yesterday that, the problems on Wall Street are, could leave the state with a bigger deficit than they anticipated, which would further complicate and make it harder for them to find any kind of wiggle room in that contract.
And judging going off of your point there, when they're talking about possibly shortening the deal and the governor left the door open to shortening the deal, there are those sweeteners on the back end of the CSEA deal. So that, I mean, it would be interesting to see
But the governor did say those first 3 years are key.
Right, they're key, but then, if CSEA agreed to these deals for, the 4 days of furlough days repaid in the end, how does that work into a PEF deal when if it's shortened?
And we should just say, I mean, the sweeteners at the end, they would get 2% base wage increases in the last 2 years, and wages would be frozen for the first 3.
Right, and these are all, if you're a worker, these are all very frustrating, very uncertain times, and that kind of goes to what's happening now on Wall Street, where these ongoing demonstrations are happening. You've got these kind of mixed signals coming from the Bloomberg administration down there where, the mayor said, well, I understand people's, desire to protest, and you've even had the governor and President Obama say they understand people's frustration, but at the same time, this is costing the city money. It's now beginning to annoy some of the people who actually live in downtown Manhattan. I mean, at the same time, though, a lot of people, it's a very passionate topic. We did a call-in show last night where, there are a lot of passionate voices on both sides of this. Where is this going? Where is this headed?
Who knows? I mean, the interesting is what the protesters want is kind of a muddled message. They want reform, they want more democracy, less corporate greed, but they don't really specify how that would translate into actual legislation or what kind of practical steps they want. And it's interesting how you see this kind of being glommed onto by other people, like the unions now making the case for the millionaires tax, for renewal of the state's millionaires tax, and using these protests as a vehicle for that. There is a lot of anger out there, and especially directed at Wall Street, and these things could kind of catch fire.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of like like you said, a free-floating anger, if you will. And a lot of people have compared this to the Tea Party, maybe fairly or unfairly. I don't know if that's necessarily accurate or not, but there is this kind of free-floating, directionless anger that a lot of people feel, even people who aren't even protesting.
Well, I think this goes to Glenn's point. We don't really know where this is going, and that's why Governor Cuomo was very careful in how he responded when asked what he thought about this whole movement. He basically said that he understood people's anger and their frustration because the economy is bad. We all wanted to get better, but he pretty much stopped at that. He didn't endorse it. He didn't not endorse it.
Right.
He took a very neutral stance, and that's to be expected. The governor's very careful. He thinks about things pretty carefully before he makes a move on them.
Right.
The one thing that is fairly clear at this point is it's not just going to go away.
That's true.
Especially heading into an election, a federal election year, a presidential election year, and we've seen kind of copycat movements spring up. Will we see something in Albany at the Capitol? We very well could.
Well, there's protests planned for Albany. We've seen some in D.C., Syracuse, Boston. So, yeah, certainly there is this kind of growing sense of protest and demonstration over what's been going on. I mean, I just think it seems that people are frustrated at nearly every single facet of power, right now, of banks, of Wall Street business, the media, politicians, government. It just seems people are angry at those who are in a position of power and influence right now.
And not to be too cynical about it, but I think once there's some polling done on where this is all coming from and how people feel about this movement, then you may see politicians making more declarative statements about the Occupy Wall Street movement.
Mm-hmm. So, okay, let's move on to just one last thing here. We saw talk about interesting protests. We saw a pretty contentious hearing that the Assembly held on hydrofracking. And John, I actually want to start with you because you had a really good story about a internal Department of Health report that came out showing that it's not just the DEC that has concerns about personnel, it's the DOH.
Essentially, the DEC, the Department of Health, Department of Ag and Markets, and the Public Service Commission all are going to see increased tasks and assist with regulation, et cetera, and they're going to need more resources. So we haven't really heard the governor take a firm position. We've certainly seen some signs of where his administration is heading with the hydrofracking issue.
Especially the DEC.
But to me, the answer is going to come in the budget. They're going to have to not only allocate additional resources, but approve a fee structure to fund it, basically. So when that budget comes out in January, that's when we may have our answer.
Yeah, and I think the industry is expecting that if hydrofracking moves forward in New York, that they would be expected to basically foot the regulation and oversight bill through permit fees and other fees. And I think the governor pretty much said that when he spoke on this topic a couple of days ago. He basically said if resources for regulation and oversight are going to be needed to be in place if there's fracking, then they will be. And that's where they'll come from.
And essentially that's what the DEC is tasking. They have an advisory panel with, I think it's 15 or 18 members.
Right, you've got members of the gas industry plus environmentalists and other, the word I hate, stakeholders, but they're, for lack of a better phrase, they're stakeholders who are on that panel.
Essentially what they're saying to that panel is, with our current fee structure, by our estimates, we would take in a couple $100,000 a year. We need somewhere...
That's not a lot of money.
No, that's not. They need somewhere in the $20 million range a year for the DEC alone. So they're basically saying to that panel, help us bridge that gap.
Yeah, I mean, they're talking about using this fee structure to regulate the industry, but at the same time, it's obviously not going to be as lucrative potentially in the startup. Where do we find this money to regulate if, and the governor said the word if about 50 times before saying hydrofracking is allowed, but if it is allowed, where do we get this money? How do we shift these resources around?
Yeah, I mean, it's going to come from the industry, I would think. I mean, I think that's what they're saying. But again, it's a little bit of a difficult conundrum because the governor has run on no new taxes, no new fees, we've got to get the budget under control. His task, I think, is going to be to communicate to people that while this may grow the budget, and I hate that term too, you're going to be getting fees from the industry that is then going to be theoretically producing lots of revenue for the state.
Well, I mean, the fees, the money from the gas industry is the reason we're doing this. I mean, or one of the reasons we're doing this. I mean, and clean energy, obviously,
keep
too.
the gas industry away if they know there's going to be high fees in New York.
That's economic development, jobs, and fees is one of the big selling points of hydrofracking. I mean, there wouldn't be this huge debate going on about it if it wasn't a bonus to the state. Or at least they think there's a bonus to the state.
Okay, we're almost out of time, but I just want to go around the table before we're done and just ask you guys very quickly if you could just tell us what you're going to be looking to covering next week. John,
the
I'll start
PEF
with you.
contract. There's no doubt about it. We might see it this weekend, but I don't think there's any doubt that the PEF contract is the dominant story right now.
Okay, Glenn, and you can't say PEF because he just said it.
All right, then I'll say hydrofracking. No.
Erica.
And I'll say we have to keep looking at what's going to happen on Wall Street because it's going to have a huge impact on the budget because Wall Street accounts for 20% of the money that state government needs to operate.
Are you saying we should watch out for that millionaire's tax?
I don't think so. I think that it's clear that both the governor and the Senate Republicans are against it.
Okay, that's all the time we have. Eric, Glenn, John, thanks for joining us tonight.